Welcome to the podcast Corner of Special Education. My name is Karsten Skrulle Gundersen, and I wish you a most warmly welcome to my Corner of Special Education. In the last season, the main topic was health, and true to that formula, this season will also have a main theme, rare diagnosis. I started working with the ordinary episodes of this season last summer and recorded the last one just before Christmas. Through this period, I've had the privilege of talking to different professionals and experts, and during our conversations, we've used different perspectives and lenses to talk about different diagnoses with aim to raise awareness and the understanding for each one. And I hope you as a listener will learn something new. In this third ordinary episode of Season 6, you will hear my conversation with Gail Hilton, Director of Programs for the Childhood Dementia Initiative. Ever since I saw the Norwegian TV series Team Pølsa and was first introduced to childhood dementia, I wanted to learn more about it. So I got in contact with Gail and I sat down with her for a conversation last summer to learn more about what childhood dementia is, how it affects the individual and the family, among other things. Hopefully, this conversation will provide a greater understanding for you as a listener about childhood dementia. With that, here's my conversation with Gail Hilton. Okay, and with that, I would once again welcome to the podcast Corner of Special Education and the series Let's Talk About. And today's topic is child dementia. And this is really a topic I know really little about. So I'm truly honored that today's guests is taking the time to join this episode to learn both me and you as a listener more about this diagnosis. So with that, welcome, Gail. I'm truly grateful for you taking the time to join this show. Why don't you give a short introduction about yourself and your role?
Thanks, Karsten. So my name's Gail Hilton. I'm the Director of Programs at the Childhood Dementia Initiative over in Australia. I'm actually a co-founder of the initiative, and we're the only organisation in the world that is representing the entire childhood dementia cohort. So it's kind of quite early work. We've been going for about 5 years. And I came to this work after a career really in the not-for-profit or charity space, working alongside families with children of all sorts of chronic conditions. And now I found myself in the childhood dementia space.
Perfect. Now, is it, I said child dementia and you said childhood. What is the correct term?
Well, we use the language childhood dementia, but really what it is dementia that presents in childhood, so under 18 years old. So I think it would be fine to say child dementia or dementia in children.
Correct. Now, just to start from the bottom, what is childhood dementia?
So I think that's the most important question, really, Karsten. So there's different ways that you can think about it. Essentially, childhood dementia is a condition that is caused by more than 100 different genetic disorders that impact in childhood. So childhood dementia is a collective term for these conditions. There's more than 100 of them that exist, and essentially they are all neurodegenerative in nature. So the symptoms start presenting in childhood. Very sadly, these are all life-limiting conditions from the point of diagnosis. So there are no treatments and there are no cures. And then the brain is involved in the, and hence the language neurodegeneration. So families will watch their child progressively decline. They will lose skills that they've already acquired. And that's actually one of the hallmarks when we're looking to see whether a condition is childhood dementia, and there can be real challenges in getting that diagnosis. Often what is seen is that a child's development will start to slow down. They might start missing normal developmental milestones, so then there's a real delay in development. But the hallmark of childhood dementia is the loss of previously acquired skills. So they will actually start regressing in their abilities.
Correct. And at what time do you see this development?
So I think it's really important to bear in mind that every child with dementia is unique. So this does appear differently across, different children. But what we see typically is that in those sort of age 3, 4, 5 years old, where you're really looking for some of those milestones, that is when symptoms can begin to most often be seen, as some of those milestones are not being met, and then parents begin to investigate more about what is happening for their child. But that doesn't mean that there are also some of these conditions that can present very early in childhood, in the first year of life. It tends to be that the earlier we see symptoms, I think of it as progressive brain damage that's happening. The earlier that we see these symptoms, often the more rapid the decline. And likewise, there can also be some of these conditions, the symptoms don't pop up until later, maybe even in teenage years. And then the decline might be slower. So for some of these children, 50% will sadly die before their 10th birthday, and about 70% will die before they're 18. But that also means that 30% will make that transition into adulthood and adult services as well.
And the variation between boys and girls, what do we know about that?
So we don't see a dramatic difference between boys and girls. Of the 100 genetic conditions that cause childhood dementia, there are some that, because of their genetic inheritance pattern, there are some of those conditions that only impact boys and some that only impact girls. But broadly, I actually think at this stage, there's not enough data across all of these conditions in real life that would enable us to really build a clear picture of the discrepancies there. So I think, as far as I know, we would sort of look that this is even numbers across boys and girls. And I should say, Carsten, just to give you a scale of the challenge of the issue of childhood dementia, 1 in 2,900 babies born will have one of these disorders that results in childhood dementia. And that's a similar incidence to cystic fibrosis in developed countries. So, and when you bring these 100 genetic conditions together, individually all very rare, but when you bring them together, they become a whole lot less rare.
Mm-hmm. And for yourself and your interest in this diagnosis, what made you, where did your interest begin?
It's a good question. So I spent about 10 years in children's oncology before moving into this space. And I actually took a job for one of the very rare conditions that causes childhood dementia. It's called Sanfilippo syndrome. And it was a local organisation close to my home. And so I started working there at the Sanfilippo Children's Foundation in Sydney. And it was started by a lady called Megan Mack, who has 2 children diagnosed with Sanfilippo syndrome, a type of childhood dementia herself. And it was actually there that Meg started talking about seeing that there were many conditions, not just Sanfilippo syndrome, that caused dementia in children, and that there must be a better way to address these different rare diseases. If we look at how we can gather economies of scale, raise awareness, raise attention of what are the common symptoms presenting for children and the common issues that families who are caring for those children face. And she said, childhood dementia has been described in the literature for many years, but not taken on in the general public language. But I think that there's something there. So from there, that's when we commissioned a burden of disease study, and we built the evidence base around childhood dementia, and we together launched the Childhood Dementia Initiative 5 years ago.
Correct. Now, I know that you visited Norway and Oslo just recent, and we tried to to schedule this conversation for then, but it wasn't that easy. But I read on the webpage of Churchill that the correct name of the site. You have to help me.
Yes, it's the Churchill Fellowship Trust, or the Churchill Trust that provides Churchill Fellowships.
Yeah, correct. Thank you. And there it stated that you were going to look into care models for children with dementia worldwide, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But you also had a chat with a father to Syver, which participated in a Achieve program here in Norway. And for myself, and I would also say that for many here in Norway, the childhood dementia was a rarely known diagnosis, which both the TV program and Syver's family and Syver himself has done a great work to raise awareness. And could you just your experience from this meeting and your visit to Norway? Could you elaborate around that?
Yeah, I have to say, Carsten, it was a wonderful experience and very moving. I think to come to a country, and first of all, of course, every meeting with every family is a real honor and a real privilege, and I think that family that you talk about has done a huge amount to share, such significant insights as to what living with childhood dementia really looks like. And as a result, as you say, what I found when I came to Norway was this awareness across the country that childhood dementia is something that exists in the children's health world and impacts quite a significant number of children. So that was very heartening to see, and I had a very special visit with that family to the research lab, where the money that they have raised has gone directly into research around gene therapy potential treatments for one of these conditions that causes childhood dementia. So, just so powerful to see what, advocacy and the voices of families can do and how transformative that is. I also think, and what we talked about a lot, myself and that family, was just, the huge burden that also comes with in every way, sort of logistically and emotionally, and that it's very much time now that, that awareness has been raised, that it's time for other people to take on the responsibility of childhood dementia and driving awareness and driving research.
And if we are taking the more worldwide perspective and the awareness of childhood dementia worldwide, what we know what we know about that?
I think what we know, Carsten, is that there's a long way to go. So there are pockets, and I think Norway are very ahead in the ways of thinking and awareness. Australia, is doing well as well, and Scotland is another country that's really taken some big strides in this space. There are pockets across the world of really significant activity, but childhood dementia is not necessarily language that is used broadly yet. I think there are lots of countries that use different language and that might respond to a slightly different grouping. So they might talk about neurodegenerative conditions or severe neurological impairment or progressive neurological decline. A lot of that, I think, families experience as medical jargon, and they don't necessarily know what that means. They don't know what that really looks like for their child, and the general public, and the broader community, I think, find it very difficult to connect with what the child's experience is going to be. But when they use that language, childhood dementia, something different happens for people who hear that language. They can really understand what that might look like. And I know the family that you were talking about, the teenager who describes his own experience, he says, well, I use the language childhood dementia because it helps people care for me better.
And when it comes to different kind of diagnosis, it's to know that you have kind of diagnosis. Either it's the dyslexia or autism, ADHD, or other diagnosis. You have just to know to have a language for it and an understanding, and the value of that.
I think so, because when you look at this, there are 100, let's just say it's 100, I think it's more than 140, but rare conditions. And many of these conditions have names that are incredibly difficult to remember, or they're just a collection of letters and numbers that represent, the genetic fault that's occurred. And so they're meaningless. So what families then tell us is that they spend a lot of time trying to explain what that disease and what the condition means for their child. And it's very challenging for them to build, that understanding in their support network of what's going to happen. But when they start to use the language childhood dementia, it just unlocks a whole different level of understanding.
I was wondering about the historic context of of childhood dementia. Could you provide a brief summary in the historic perspective, if it's possible?
I will do my best. Childhood dementia has been defined in the academic literature for many decades, and I think we've certainly found academic papers from as long ago as the 1940s, but I think even some that existed before that. And one of the academic papers that has guided us in a lot of our foundational work is now close to 25 years old, and it was a study specifically on childhood dementia and defining what that means and what the criteria are to be met to be classed as childhood dementia. And so I suppose, that's sort of the early days of what the literature looked like. I know from around the world there are some of the conditions that cause childhood dementia where that language has been used for a long time, and that this is, it's absolutely not new language and it's not a new diagnosis. But what it is new, I suppose, is bringing it, is elevating it into the general public. As I said, we're the first organisation and we're only 5 years old. So you might be able to say, in some ways, well, childhood dementia, has existed for a very long time, but really, in practice of actually taking some action and sort of really advocating for childhood dementia to be taken on as common language in the health system and globally. I think that work has only been happening really for 5 years.
Yeah. So it's quite a new work we're talking about here.
I think it's a really, it's a new paradigm, I think, really, or it's a paradigm shift to, and whether that's a case of, that these diseases were previously in some arenas described as neurodegenerative or something else, or whether these diseases have always been simply named by their cause, Batten disease or Niemann-Pick C or leukodystrophy. This is, yes, a new umbrella term. And I liken that very much to, childhood cancer, for example, is a grouping. It's an umbrella term for a number of many different types of cancer. Cerebral palsy is another one, and aging dementia itself. So I didn't realize until I was in this space that dementia that impacts older people has more than 100 different causes.
Really? Okay, there you go. And that, yeah, and that, one of the main goals and my main ambition with this show is to focus on the more narrow topics like childhood dementia and a more rare diagnosis, and to in that way provide a greater understanding. So hopefully with this conversation we can do just that. If we're talking about the most recent research, what does it tell us about childhood dementia?
So I guess the area that I'm across most is looking at, some of the care landscape, but also what the impact of these conditions are on the people that care for children. And that's some of the most recent research that we have been involved in Australia, is looking at the impact for families and carers. And so what we have found is that, these are chronic conditions that impact a child over a number of years. On average, it's probably around 10 years or so, and that those care needs are ever increasing. Because of the genetic nature of these conditions, sometimes there can be more than one child in a family impacted. So about 20% of families will have more than one child diagnosed. And so the impact of that, I think, is huge. And we're only just beginning to uncover that. We're uncovering very high levels of anxiety in this carer population. We're beginning to understand that, at least one parent probably gives up work, more than likely gives up work. Families may relocate to be in a more appropriate sort of setting to only have one income here in Australia. Of course, then, we haven't yet had the research that's delved into what is the experience of siblings, for example, that are not diagnosed themselves. They watch their older or younger brother or sister decline until sadly they die over many years, and what's that experience for them. So I think we certainly understand that the ramifications for the carers is huge, as well as, of course, for the child themselves and how much they suffer, really is the word, and the struggles that they go through. And then what we have also really been uncovering here in Australia, and I kind of do feel that even though healthcare systems are different around the world and social care systems are different around the world, I think broadly I could say, families with these conditions feel that they are not well understood, and that the systems don't necessarily meet their needs as well as they could.
Correct. Yeah. And you know, when you in your answer now, you were both talking about how this affects the individual and the family, and as I said earlier in the conversation, at your website, and your work about care models for these children, what will your this is quite new work, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, of course, these children are already, they're already in the healthcare system and the social care system. Here in Australia, I think we come across a couple of big challenges, which I think I'm beginning to hear are common around the world. So something interesting about the referral to palliative care. And so pediatric palliative care is actually a discipline and an approach that is all about quality of life and symptom management and enabling children and those who love them to maximize the time that they have in the best possible way. And I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding around what palliative care is. And as a result, sometimes I think that means that these children are not referred to specialist palliative carers as early as they could be. And certainly what we hear in Australia from families is that, families do wonder why they're not connected to specialist palliative care earlier on, because it's such a valuable service when they finally do become connected. But I think, something that's also really sort of playing on my mind is that everybody who works alongside these families, whether that's in social care or education or health, needs to be considering what the palliative approach is. These are all children who sadly will die prematurely, and their families are watching that decline and know that that's going to happen. So the sensitivity and the understanding and the empathy that these families need to be, working, the professionals working with these families need to have, I think, is something really critical to reflect on, and to understand what hope looks like for families like this, who know that that what is going to happen to their child, but what do goals look like? I think it's about how do we work differently to best support families in these incredibly challenging circumstances, but that they can still, have joy in their lives. Their children can still meet, they just need to look at their goals in a different way, for example. And it might be around maintaining some of those skills for as long as possible, rather than the growing and the developing of skills that you might see in other areas of education, especially.
Yeah, correct. And this is before we started this recording. You were so kindly to set me into contact with uh, Kate Sin.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. So we are going to. I think it will be in December. We will record an episode concerning the more educational perspective of this.
Wonderful. That's her area of speciality. Yes.
Yes,
Good.
yes. It will be a very interesting episode. But I was just thinking while you were answering now, how this affects the individuals and the family and the siblings, and from your experience after several meetings, what are your experience from the more how this affects the individuals? Yeah.
The carers, the parents.
No, the children.
The children, well, as I say, so every experience of childhood dementia is unique, and so so what it looks like in a child will vary. There are a common suite of symptoms that are very commonly experienced, and they are things that you would associate with dementia. So some of those personality changes, some really challenging behaviours, which are often underpinned by fear and anxiety, as their brain degenerates ultimately. So there's an intellectual disability for the child that's sort of ever increasing. And this is then often accompanied with a physical disability as well, because the brain is stopping parts of the body working as well as they should be. And in some cases, there will also be sensory disabilities too. So there might be blindness, for example. So really, for these children, it's progressive brain damage that is happening, and then that will impact other systems of their body too. And as they progress, sadly, towards the end of their life, there will be often multiple systems that are involved. So for these children, as they become more and more sort of medically complex towards the end of their life, they might have many different specialists in their healthcare team, looking at different elements of their body and what's happening for them.
And I can imagine that this must have a great effect on the family life and the parents and caregivers and siblings. And from your experience, what do we know from their experience?
So I think, Carsten, there's two things. I think there's the practical burden of care and what that looks like, and that's not simply the burden of appointments and so on. There's a day-to-day, how does the caring for that child or multiple children in the house look? And there's a real those parents become the experts in their child, but their child's condition. They're an advocate for their child. We've already heard the stories of families that are trying to make the difference, to bring research and treatments for either their child or for children in the future. So these parents logistically are going above and beyond every day. But in parallel, they're holding grief and loss that I think none of us, unless we've walked in those shoes, can imagine. And that starts before diagnosis even. When they begin to see some signs that their children are not meeting the milestones that are expected, there's already a grief and loss of what they expected life to look like. And then a diagnosis comes, and that's an incredible blow that they know that they are looking at a life-limiting condition. And then every aspect of family life is impacted. And we talk about, all these different milestones of loss. And I think a lot of this simply hasn't been described in the literature. I always find it fascinating, really, that there is no word, even in the English language, for a parent who's lost a child. Whereas we know there are language like widower and so on. But I think there's a very unique grief experience that is very hard for anybody else to understand other than the parents. And, we hear all the time that from families that really it's only other parents who have walked in these shoes that can understand what that looks like and feels like.
Yeah. We have about 50 minutes left, so we are closing in. But if you take a perspective for, say, 5 to 10 years ahead, where do you hope or think that childhood dementia and what's the status for the childhood dementia at that point?
That's a super question. So we have a 5-year vision at the Childhood Dementia Initiative, and a broader vision than that. Essentially, what we are hoping for is global collaboration across researchers, healthcare professionals, and other care professionals, education, disability, and so on, and families themselves. To accelerate treatments, cures, and appropriate care for families wherever they live in the world, and that there's a real equity around that. What that means in the sort of more short and medium term is we're actually embarking on a global consensus project as we speak, that across the course of the next year will bring together experts globally to look at the definition of childhood dementia and ensure that across the world we will all utilise the same language and the same criteria for describing childhood dementia. And what will come from that is that's really been developed because countries like Norway and others have said we want to take this same approach in our country. So we're really looking at how we can harmonise the approach and then work collaboratively so that we can just, use the power of the collective to drive progress. Yeah. So once we've done the global consensus work, we will aim to bring all of those experts and more, and that will be across all different groups, families themselves, health professionals, care professionals, researchers, to begin to build a global research agenda for childhood dementia that will include, looking at all of the emerging therapies and really being in tune with the science as to where the science is at now, but also looking at models of care and what we need to do, to build awareness and drive attention in this space across the world. I think, this does need a global approach. We always say childhood dementia is a global issue, that needs global solutions.
And as for now, where do we stand when it comes to medicine and a cure? And where do we stand as of now?
Look, and this isn't so much my area of expertise, Carsten, but I can tell you very, sort of the top line piece is that none of these conditions have a cure, as it were, and none of them have effective treatment. So the medication and the care at the moment is all focused around symptom management. That said, there are clinical trials available because, and this has absolutely been said to me by neurologists and researchers, the science is here. And as you will probably be across, there's a lot of work happening in the gene therapy world, for example. So, I think so much of this is around making sure that we are working collaboratively on the research so that we can maximize the breakthroughs in science that are happening and bring them into this space. And hence, I think, looking at childhood dementia as a collective and building knowledge across those conditions as to, how we can fast track research, how we can collect data, how we can look at diagnosis that might work across many of those conditions. It's about building economies of scale so that we can drive that progress as quickly as we can towards cures. Yeah.
And before we get to the two last questions, for families, caregivers that are recently discovered that the child has this diagnosis, childhood dementia, what is important for them to know, to think about?
Look, I think, some families might have this diagnosis and might be hearing the language childhood dementia for the first time, or it might be unfamiliar. What do they need to think about? I think it's about, firstly, I would always say, you use the language childhood dementia how and when it suits you. What we certainly hear from families is it can be really confronting language, but that when they just talk about childhood dementia with their network, it helps their network, it activates that network to provide care and support in a better way. What families also say is that when they use the language childhood dementia with their healthcare professionals or in the emergency department, for example, it enables those health professionals to provide better care for their child. So I think it's just about, figuring out how you're describing and talking about the child's condition and what's happening for you as a family. That will be different for every family. So there's no right or wrong in any of that, certainly. And then I think, certainly some of what we're beginning to provide at the Childhood Dementia Initiative are some resources that are very much written and designed by families, but are for other families. So we do, and they are in English, but we do have some new resources. It's called the Family Guide on our website, and that we'd really encourage anybody who's interested to go and have a look at that and make sure, that newly diagnosed families have access to that. There's some beautiful resources, a letter from parents to a newly diagnosed parent, for example, because to be honest, they're the only people that can sort of talk about what should we be thinking about and how might this feel. Families are the expert.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Gail, from all the things that we have been talking about during this conversation, what do you want the listener to take home from this conversation?
I think for the listener, it's really just that message that dementia impacts children too. Whether we sort of hear people say, whether you're 2 or 100 or 2, dementia can impact. And, and just taking that learning and that knowledge that you might know of what dementia looks like in an older person and considering what that looks like in a little person's body.
Yes.
And just ensuring that, you have that empathy and understanding in your approach and that you share this new knowledge and awareness that you have.
Absolutely. And closing tip of the day, anything you want to share of value?
What's that? Across anything, Carsten?
Yeah, if you have, you mentioned your website. If there are any other resources that is of value to you that you want to share, a podcast, a book, or article, movie.
Well, of course, what I would say is if you haven't seen Team Pølsa, then Team Pølsa, then absolutely tune in and watch that. That's the best way. If you're living in Norway, that is the best way that you are going to get a really good understanding of what childhood dementia is, and why we need to address that. So yeah, that would be my tip. And also, can we please get it with some English subtitles?
I will try to reach out to the Norwegian broadcasting system to have them put on the English subtitles. Yeah,
please do. I have emailed them already, and they said we have no plans yet. But I reckon if a number of people start contacting them and saying, "Oh, everybody in Australia would want to watch it too."
So hopefully someday. Yeah. Okay, Gail, we are at the end. Once again, thank you for joining my podcast, The Corner of Special Education. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Carsten. It's been great.
Thank you. Bye-bye. That concludes the third ordinary episode of Season 6. But before our ways part, remember to follow the podcast on Spotify or where you listen to podcasts. Also, remember to follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook. Also, if you want the latest news and posts from the blog, you can sign up to the newsletter from spaceblog.no. If you have any comments or want to get in touch, don't hesitate to send me a PM or email at karsten@spetsblogg.no. As always, I really appreciate if you rate, share and recommend the podcast. Finally, thank you to all of you who have listened to this episode, and a warm welcome to new listeners and followers. And I would like to give a special thanks to Gail for taking the time to participate in this episode. If you'd like to make a voluntary contribution to the podcast and blog, you can find further details in the description of this episode. I hope to meet you again in the next episode of Corner of Special Education. Until then, take care. In the next episode of Corner of Special Education.
Nei, altså de har ikke talespråk. De kommuniserer veldig mye med gestikulering og kroppsbevegelser. Det som var veldig fint når vi fikk diagnosen, var jo at da var det var en enorm sånn bølge fra Australia til USA og via Norge i billedkommunikasjon, i det å kommunisere med bilder og sånne poddbøker, så det heter. Dette er jo blitt digitalt nå. Så vi startet jo allerede med dette den helgen vi fikk diagnosen på en måte, for vi var så heldige å møte en dame bort i Australia, som var helt rå på dette, som ikke foreningen, i samarbeid med Frambud fikk hentet til Norge og hadde en introduksjon på hva dette var for noe sånt. Så det blomstret opp. Og veldig mange ble flinke å kommunisere med kropp og bilder.